Welcome, everyone. Well, tomorrow is New Year's Day. That will be the first day of the new year, 2023. 2022 is about to become history. Many, many years ago, I looked ahead to the year 2000. The world was coming to an end in the year 2000, or so many said. Year 2000 was still in my future then. It seemed like a long way off. Eventually, the year 2000 came and went without any real issues, despite the fear that Y2K computer problems would wreak havoc all over the world. Then the world was supposed to end in 2012 at the end of the Mayan calendar, but that was a non-issue too. Over 10 years later, after the year 2012, I hardly remember the year 2000 or the year 2012 anymore. Where has the time gone? Of course, today is New Year's Eve. The night is known as a time to party and ring in the new year. There are many other customs associated with New Year's. Customs like making New Year's resolutions, kissing at midnight as we transition to the new year, and parties on the New Year's Eve. We'll get to them a little later today. But does it seem a bit odd to us that our year begins in winter, when nothing really is going on? That really wouldn't seem to make any sense. The first day on most calendars seem to have some type of major event attached to them. For example, around 3100 BC, the Egyptians noticed that the star Canis Major, that's the dog star, rose next to the sun right at dawn at the same time every year. And this was roughly the same time the Nile River flooded every year. We might know Canis Major as the star Sirius. And Sirius is the brightest star visible in the northern hemisphere and is very prominent in the night sky. Yes, I'm really serious. Oh, sorry. Ancient Egyptian legends often associate Sirius with hot weather. With the sun during the day and the arrival of Sirius at night, these two brightest stars combined to produce the heat of mid to late summer, or so the ancient Egyptians believed. But the Egyptians depended upon their annual flooding of the Nile each year for the crops that would follow. They began their calendar, their new year, on what we might call April 15th today. Then the Egyptians began a 2-week celebration beginning on August 15th called Wafa el Nile. Now, the ancient Egyptians believed that their god Osiris had been killed by Set. Now, many today believe that Set in mythology was actually Seth, the son of Noah. Anyway, they believed that the Nile flooded every year because the goddess Isis cried for her husband Osiris, who had been killed by Set. And they thought that the tears of Isis would one day somehow restore the body of Osiris. Well, anyway, they began to observe Wafa el Nile for 2 weeks every year, and they still do today, actually. But the ancient Egyptian calendar had its beginning on what we call August 15th to commemorate the annual flooding of the Nile each year that would bring them food out of what would otherwise have been a desert. But think about this for a minute. If we were to decide when the new year began, on what day of the year would we begin the new year? What would you choose? What would make the first day in our new calendar, what would it be important to us? Will we make it the August 15th to celebrate the flooding of the Nile? Well, probably not. Any ideas? When would be a good time to begin an annual calendar? Well, in the past, at least, many people grew crops and had livestock. Most people were farmers of some kind. In the past, it was mainly an agrarian society. I grew up on a farm myself. Farmers would always begin their growing season in the spring. When warmer temperatures arrived, it also meant more daylight. And spring showers were also helpful to newly planted crops. That's the time to start your crops. And that would seem to be a logical time to begin a new year, at the beginning of a new growing season. So we might begin our calendars at the beginning of the spring. And they would end, of course, our calendar would end the same time next year when the winter harvest was finished and it was time for a new growing season to begin. And this would coincide roughly with the spring equinox. Our growing season would begin roughly at the time of the vernal equinox. That takes place today on our calendars around March 20th or 21st. It seems that many ancient calendars had their first day begin on the vernal equinox. Even today, the calendars used in Iran and Afghanistan begin their new year on the vernal equinox. Many ancient civilizations began their calendar year based on the growing season starting in the spring of the year. That was a very popular thing. But what about God's calendar? Now, God gave us a calendar so we would know when to observe His appointed times. Now, God has an annual calendar based on the sun and the moon. And like many of the ancient calendars, this calendar was based on the growing season. It had months, or months, you might call it, corresponding to the position of the moon. God's calendar is primarily lunar-based. It's based on the lunar cycle. Now, each new moon begins the new month, or what we call month. The new moon is always day 1 of the month. 15 days later, the moon will be full. And about 15 days after that, the moon will be new again. That's a total of 30 days, which is close to the lunar cycle. But the moon actually appears to complete one orbit around the Earth in approximately 29.5 days. So some months will have 30 days and some actually more like 29. But this calendar corrects itself. At every new moon, the cycle begins again. If we somehow lost track of what day of the month it is, we could come very close to knowing what it is by looking at the moon. If the moon was at first quarter, it would be around day 7. Last quarter would make it more like day 22. But no worries. At the end of the cycle, when the next new moon appears, the month begins all over again, correcting any error we might have had in the previous month. That's a pretty neat trick there. To keep track of the date on God's calendar, we don't need a watch or some kind of mechanical or electronic timepiece. We can look at the sky for that. The moon becomes our timepiece to determine our months, just as God promised in Genesis 1, verse 14, where He said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, and for days and years." Of course, with a monthly cycle lasting about 29.5 days, 12 months would account for only 354 days per year. And that would be 11 days short of an actual year. So an extra month, the 13th month of the year, is inserted. It happens 7 times during a 19-year period to correct this error. Turn with me, if you would, to Exodus chapter 12. That's Exodus chapter 12. We'll be right there in verse 1. So every 19 years, the lunar cycle returns to where it was 19 years previously. It's easy to determine the day of the month, that is, assuming we can agree on exactly when a new moon occurs. But how do we determine the beginning of the year on God's original calendar? Well, again, let's look at Exodus 12, verse 1. "And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you." So there we have it. Here we see God tell the Israelites which month would be the first month of the year to them. But it doesn't specifically tell us when the year begins. Verse 3. "Speak you unto all the congregation of Israel, saying, In the 10th day of the month they shall take to them every man a lamb, according to the house of their fathers, a lamb for a house." Now, if we keep reading in chapter 12, we'll see that this is speaking of preparing the Passover. That'll become obvious if you don't already get that. And of course, this is also the time for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's observed from the 15th day of the first month until the 21st day of the first month. And of course, we said the new moon is day 1 on any given month of the calendar. Leviticus 23. Leviticus 23, verse 4, if you would. That's Leviticus chapter 23 and verse 4. But again, when does that first month of the year begin? How do we know when the first month of the year starts? It seems the Bible doesn't directly tell us. But again, Leviticus 23, verse 4. "These are the feasts, or the appointed times, of the Lord, even holy convocations, which you shall proclaim in their seasons. And the 14th day of the first month at even is the Lord's Passover." So again, we see that the Passover is to be observed during the first month of the year. Verse 6. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread unto the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. In the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You should do no servile work therein. And this is, of course, the first annual holy day of the year. Verse 8. But you shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord 7 days. And the 7th day is a holy convocation. You should do no servile work therein. Now hold your place here in Leviticus 23, if you would. We're coming right back to it in a minute, so hold your place here in Leviticus 23. We see in verse 8 that the 7th day of this feast is to be the second annual holy day, or appointment of God. And that will give us a holy day on the 15th day of the first month, and 7 days later on the 21st day of the first month. So again, Exodus 34, verse 18. But again, when does the first month of God's calendar begin? We know that the Feast of Unleavened Bread occurs in the first month. We saw that at the beginning of God's year. So again, Exodus 34, verse 18. The Feast of Unleavened Bread shall you keep. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, as I commanded you, in the time of the month Abib. For in the month Abib you came out of Egypt. So we see that we're to keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread in the month of Abib. The word Abib means the greening of the grain, basically. So why is this important? Well, during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the first grain bundle, or sheaf, from the spring barley harvest was required to be waved before God. So if the first month of the year came too early, the grain wouldn't be ripe. It wouldn't be greening. After about 1 month after ripening up, the barley grain would be a bit too ripe and begin to fall over. So therefore, the barley had to be harvested in a fairly narrow period of time. That time roughly corresponds to the beginning of spring. And that is when God's new year began. At the new moon, when the barley was greening. However, as we said, each lunar cycle takes about 29.5 days to complete, with 12 months accounting for only 354 days. The beginning of the next year would occur, 11 days earlier. So after several years, the new year would begin in the winter before the barley was ready for harvest. Of course, that would make it impossible for the priest to have the first grain sheaf to be waved. So back to Leviticus 23. Hope you held your place there. Drop down a couple of verses there to verse 11. We'll see the sheaf there. Leviticus 23:11. He shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted for you. On the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. And this is during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So this was to be done in the first month of the year on God's calendar. This foreshadowed, of course, the first of the first fruits to be accepted by God. That would be Jesus Christ, of course. But should the barley not be ready after the 12 months of a given year, a 13th month will be added. And then by the following month, the barley would be ready. So the first month on God's calendar was set to occur in the spring at the time of the early barley harvest. Now this would be very near the time of the equinox. But since the new moon was required to start the beginning of the new month, the beginning of God's year is not directly associated with the equinox. We should probably talk a lot more about God's calendar in the future. There is some debate as to how exactly to define the beginning of God's month and the beginning of his year. But for now, just understand that God's calendar is based on the growing season, as were so many other ancient calendars. And also that our growing season and our harvests are an analog to God's children learning and growing, if you will, to become mature in the faith until our harvest time comes at the return of Jesus Christ and at the last day, when we will be brought, or harvested, you might say, into God's great kingdom. But what about the calendar we use here in the United States? It's also used by most of the world today. Most today use the Gregorian calendar. Now, this was a revision of the Julian calendar in an attempt to improve its accuracy, which it did. The Julian calendar lost 11 hours and 14 seconds every year. That might not sound like much, but in 100 years it lost over 1,000 hours, meaning over 46 days. But then the Julian calendar was based on the earlier Roman calendar that was alleged to have been based on even earlier calendars. Well, the origin of what is now the Gregorian calendar actually began on the spring equinox, when the growing season began, just like the others did. And that made sense. Now, January and February were not part of the original calendar. In the original calendar, the earlier calendar, there were only 10 months in the year. Now, after the 10 months, well, the winter didn't really have its own months. The beginning of the year, March 1st at the time, occurred on the spring equinox. Like I said, that made sense. But then the second Roman king, Numa Pompilius, added 2 months to the calendar at the end of the year. That's right, the end of the year. And he called them January and February. Now, the month of February was named for the Roman festival of Februalia. I'll get it right. Februalia. Now, from the website learnreligions.com/the Roman Februalia Festival, quote, "The festival known as Februalia was held near the end of the Roman calendar year, and to understand how the holiday changed over time, it helps a bit to know the calendar's history. Originally, the Roman year had only 10 months. They counted out 10 months between March and December, and basically disregarded the dead months, which would be January and February." End quote. With only 10 months in the original year, sept kind of means 7. And so September was the 7th month of the year. Oct means 8. Think of the number of tentacles an octopus has, for example. So October was the 8th month of the year. Nov or Nov really means 9. November was the 9th month of the year. And Dec represents 10. Think of a decade. And December represented the 10th month of the year. So I said, originally the months of January and February were not in the calendar. Back to the article. Later, the Etruscans came along and added these 2 months back into the equation. In fact, they planned to make January the first month, but the expulsion of the Etruscan dynasty prevented this from happening, and so March 1st was considered the first day of the year. February was dedicated to Februus, a god not unlike Dis or Pluto, because it was the month in which Rome was purified by making offerings and sacrifices to the gods of the dead. But eventually, as we know, January did become the first day of the year and not March. So from Botanica.com, we read, "We can partly thank the Roman king Numa Pompilius. According to a tradition, during his reign, Numa revised the Roman Republican calendar so that January replaced March as the first month. It was a fitting choice, since January was named after Janus, the Roman god of all beginnings, and March celebrated Mars, the god of war. However, there is evidence that January 1st was not made an official start of the Roman year until 153 BCE. Now, of course, when January and February became the first 2 months of the year, September, October, November, and December, formerly the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th months of the year, now became the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th months of the year, respectively. And their names no longer made any sense. So if you wonder why their names don't make any sense today, well, now you know why. Now, due to the drifting of the earlier inaccurate calendars, they kept drifting because they weren't very accurate. The equinox drifted away from March 1st and closer to the end of the month. For the Gregorian calendar, 11 days were removed from the Julian calendar to try to correct the errors, but they still left the equinox occurring around the 21st day of March. Oh, by the way, before I forget it, the Gregorian calendar is named after Pope Gregory XIII, but it was actually based on a calendar created by Luigi Lillo. He was an astronomer, among other things, and he was kind of tasked to do this, but the credit went to the Pope. Okay. Well, after January and February were added to the existing calendar in the distant past, January 1 became the first day of our year. And some will tell us that the New Year's Day, well, that represents the day that Jesus Christ was circumcised, coming on the 8th day of his life as a human being. But, of course, we know that Jesus Christ was not born on December 25th anyway. Really, January 1st has no significance at all as far as I can tell. You might want to study this for yourselves. It can be a bit complicated with changes occurring over thousands of years. But the bottom line here is that the first day of the year, January 1st, signifies no single event, or growing season, or anything really. But despite having no relation to anything, New Year's Day and New Year's Eve do have traditions that are observed today. What are the origins of these traditions? Are they biblical, or might they be associated with the ways the heathen served their gods? Well, let's take a look. What about the ball drop in Times Square every year at midnight as we transition to the new year? Go from the website bhg.com/holidays, New Year's traditions, history of the ball drop. Quote, the tradition of using balls to tell time has been around for centuries, dating back to the early 1800s. The first documented time ball was on top of England's Royal Observatory at Greenwich, where it would drop at 1 p.m. each afternoon as a way to let nearby ships and boats know what time it was. This was before watches or cell phones, so the ball dropping was the primary way to tell time. I didn't know that. So for the big New Year's Eve celebration in Times Square, a time ball was a natural way to symbolize one period ending and another beginning. The very first Times Square New Year's Eve celebration took place on December 31st, 1904. But there was no ball drop that year. The event was organized by Adolph Ochs, the owner of the New York Times. The newspaper had just opened its headquarters in Times Square, and Ochs wanted a memorable way to ring in the new year and celebrate the newspaper's milestones. That year, 200,000 people gathered in the streets of New York City to celebrate. Wow. Each year after the 1904 event, Ochs organized bigger and more elaborate New Year's Eve parties in Times Square. In December of 1907, he commissioned a large New Year's Eve ball that would be lowered as the crowd counted down to midnight. The ball was made of iron and wood and weighed over 700 pounds. The official Waterford Crystal Times Square New Year's Eve ball, the one that's used today, is decorated with modern LED lighting. The ball measures 6 feet across and weighs more than 11,000 pounds. The computerized lighting technology can display more than 16,000 colors and patterns, which is why the ball has a different display each year. Close quote. Many today observe the changing of one year to another on our modern Gregorian calendar. Whether they watch a ball drop in Times Square or just watch a clock or to observe the beginning of the new year, they still observe that. But allow me to digress for just a moment, if you would. Of course, we use God's calendar to meet on His appointed times, for Bible prophecy, and in short, for anything on God's timetable. But as our Bibles tell us, we are in the world. We're in the world, but of course not of it. So whether we like it or not, our lives are affected by the modern Gregorian calendar. It's used for tax purposes. The new year begins a new tax season. Now, for example, we need to send out statements concerning the past year's contributions at year's end. It could be a nice time to start a project. It's a round date and easy to remember. That makes it easy to keep track of when something important did happen. If we start a project on January 1st, it's easy to remember how long we've been working with it. Now, not that we should delay our task until January 1st, but if that date's really close, there's just something people like about round numbers and things that begin at easy to remember times. I'm horrible basically at remembering dates. I know some of you have asked me when certain things happen in my life, and often I just can't remember the dates. I guess I never committed them to memory, but I've never been good at remembering things. But ask me when I was ordained. I can answer that question. January 1st. I might well remember that date anyway, since that was an important moment for me, but I won't forget that. Ask me when I recorded my first television show. Well, that too occurred on January 1st. So I'll never forget that. Easy to remember. Ask me when I began the weekly services here that we do. I can't remember. I believe it was in November, but I have no idea when the actual date was. So it's easy to remember the first day of the year. Other dates, at least for me, maybe not so much, but turn with me if you would over to Matthew chapter 5. That's Matthew chapter 5 and verse 14. Matthew chapter 5, verse 14. So I suppose we could all retreat and live in a commune and ignore man's Gregorian calendar, but our Bibles tell us to go into all the world. In fact, in Mark 16, verse 15, Jesus told his disciples, "Go you into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." And of course, we're told to be the light of the world. Again, Matthew 5, verse 14. These are the words of Christ, by the way. He says, "You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it gives light unto all that are in the house." And verse 16 looks like a commandment to me, but see what you think. Verse 16. "Let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven." So if we hide from the world, we can't do what Jesus asked of his disciples. So, since we are in the world, we need to use a modern Gregorian calendar in addition to God's calendar, of course. And speaking of taxes, as I said earlier, Jesus tells us to pay our taxes and obey our governments, at least until they ask us to break God's law. Again, our tax year is based on the Gregorian calendar, and we need to use this calendar to function in the world today. So my bottom line here is that while we need to keep God's calendar, and especially his appointed times, we must at the same time observe the modern Gregorian calendar today. If we're acknowledging the beginning of a new year on man's calendar, or beginning something with an easy to remember date, I don't personally find that in and of itself sinful. However, I'm sure you knew this was coming, okay? However, there are some things about the new year that Christians should avoid. I happened to be having dinner one time with my family. It just happened to be New Year's Day. We'd invited a friend of the family over to have dinner with us, and they brought a dish to share. It was nice of them. I can't remember exactly what all was in it, but I do know it was basically black-eyed peas and pork. Well, our guest stated that eating this dish, containing the black-eyed peas and pork on January 1st, would bring us good luck for the rest of the year. Now, this person, identifying as a Christian, by the way, was suggesting that the way to peace and good luck was to eat a certain dish, black-eyed peas and pork to be specific, it just had to be pork, on the first day of the man-defined year. Do black-eyed peas with pork have the power to give us good fortune, especially if we eat them on the first day of the year? Well, to me, this seems a bit like idolatry, to believe that something like a certain food or foods would cause us to have good luck or good fortune. Now, food might keep us nourished, but food might keep us nourished, but it has no power to determine our luck or our peace or future for the next year. If we want to be blessed in the coming year, what should true Christians do? How about praying to the true God? And especially combining that with keeping his commandments. That's what we should do if we wish God to bless us. But why would anyone even suggest, especially a Christian, why would they suggest eating a certain food on the first day of the year to bring us good luck? Where'd they get this idea? Well, we'll find out shortly, so hang in there. From the website, thescribesportion.com, from an article titled "The Pagan Origin of New Year's Day," quote, "Humans have celebrated the start of the new year for thousands of years. In most cases, these celebrations were linked to agricultural and astronomical events. The earliest recorded New Year's Day celebration was 4,000 years ago in Babylon. Had to be Babylon. It took place during the first new moon following the vernal equinox. Yes, the new year actually begins in spring, not winter. This was so because there was an equal amount of sunlight and darkness heralding the start of a new year and representing the rebirth of the natural world. To mark the new year, the Babylonians created a festival called Akitu. It derives from the Sumerian word for barley. Isn't that interesting? The festival lasted 11 days, and a different ritual was conducted on each day. Statues of the gods were paraded throughout the streets as rites were conducted to symbolize their victory over the forces of chaos. They believed that through these rites, the world was cleansed and recreated by the gods in preparation for the new year and the return of spring. The principal god celebrated during this festival was Marduk. That's a Babylonian sky god. Marduk was celebrated for his mythical victory over the evil sea goddess Tiamat. During Akitu, the new king was crowned, or the current monarch's rule extended. The king practiced a public ritual of humiliation during which he was brought before the statue of Marduk. He was stripped of his robes, slapped, and dragged by the ears in hope of making him cry. If he cried, this was seen as a sign that Marduk was satisfied and extended his rule. The modern celebration of New Year's Day originates from the Roman celebration of the god Janus. This god's full name is Janus Bifrons, meaning the god who looked both ways. It explains why Janus has two faces, as a representation of his ability to look back into the past and forward into the future. This idea was tied to the concept of transition from one year to the next, from one vision to the next, and growth into adulthood. He was also worshipped at the beginning of the harvest season, planting times, marriages, births, deaths, etc. Romans celebrated January 1st by offering sacrifices to Janus in hopes of gaining good fortune in the new year. End quote, for now. I think we'll see that many of our New Year's traditions are based on looking to false gods to bless us in the coming year. Check that out as we go through this today. Let's go ahead and continue back in this article again. Quote, they decorated their homes with laurel branches and spent the day partying. It was common for friends and family to exchange well wishes and gift figs and honey. Gifts were exchanged because they believed the beginning of anything was an omen for the whole. Kissing at the moment of transition into the next year is rooted in pagan sexual practice and superstition. End quote. Now, concerning this midnight kiss on New Year's Eve, according to Daniel Campora, Ph.D. and Associate Professor of English Language and Literature at the University of Toledo, where he teaches courses on folklore, this kiss is part of both English and German folklore, which indicate that whoever a person is with at midnight pretends what type of luck they will have for the rest of the year. Well, maybe it's not the black-eyed peas and the pork we eat on New Year's Day, but rather who we kiss at the beginning of the new year that determines our luck for the next year. I don't know. Back to the article. Watch night services were conducted to watch out for evil spirits who were believed to roam the earth during those times. Hence comes a tradition. Hence comes the tradition of staying up to ring in the new year. And more on the ringing in the new year shortly. Continuing. Eating pork and black-eyed peas on New Year's Day originates from homage to Janus. His mythological wife, Karna, was honored during her festival with a dish of fava beans and pork bacon. The peas or beans symbolize rebirth, and pork or swine was the preferred sacrificial meat to the gods. So there's where the black-eyed peas and pork came from. I always wondered about that. Well, in an attempt to Christianize January celebrations, the Catholic Church created the Feast of the Circumcision. Supposedly, this day venerated Christ's 8th day of life following Jewish tradition. End quote. Of course, as we said earlier, Christ wasn't even born in the winter. What about the phrase ringing in the new year? Where did that originate? And what does that mean? Well, again, from a website, this one, mentalfloss.com, in an article titled, Why Do We Ring in the New Year? Quote, communities used to bid adieu to the old year and welcome the new one by ringing bells, often in churches. The tradition may have grown out of other occasions where bells marked an end. Passing bells tolled when someone died, or celebrated a beginning like wedding bells. Wall Street's Trinity Church rang in the new year with a veritable concert put on by the church's official bell ringer, James E. Aleph. As the New York Herald reported in 1860, there floated from the high church tower the stirring music of 8 bells, chiming in changes and making the air redolent with harmony. According to Trinity Church's archives, the earliest mention of the tradition is from the minutes of an 1807 meeting where parishioners allotted £8 to the person who rang the bells on New Year's Day. It might have been going on long before that, considering the church got its first bell back in 1698. In short, ringing bells was once a central part of the holiday. The fact that it's faded from memory and ringing the new year makes little sense if you don't know the phrase's history may help explain why so many people now say ring in the new year instead. What about New Year's resolutions? What about those? Well, from an article I found at history.com, the ancient Babylonians are said to have been the first people to make New Year's resolutions some 4,000 years ago. They were also the first to hold recorded celebrations in honor of the New Year. They also made promises to the gods to pay their debts and return any objects they'd borrowed. These promises could be considered the forerunners of our New Year's resolutions. If the Babylonians kept to their word, their pagan gods would bestow favor on them for the coming year. If not, they would fall out of the gods' favor, a place no one wanted to be. End quote. Yet again, we see people trying to gain favor by appeasing false gods. In fireworks, and other types of noisemakers are common on New Year's Eve. This tradition was said to originate in China in the 7th century A.D. The fireworks were meant to scare off evil spirits. They're also known to bring prosperity and good luck. Even different designs and colors correspond to different types of luck, including fertility, love, and health. In Denmark, people stand on their chairs and leap into January at midnight to bring good luck and banish bad spirits. Well, I'm afraid if I jumped off a chair at midnight, my luck might not be so good. Not when I ended up breaking some bones from my fall. I know that would happen. Okay. So I don't want to move to Denmark. Okay. And of course, there are those New Year's Eve Okay. Falling off my chair's got me all upset here. Okay. Of course, there are those New Year's Eve parties. New Year's Eve parties. We're familiar with those. So from the website, resolutiondenver.com, history of New Year's Eve, quote, one of the most popular ways to welcome the upcoming year is to make a champagne toast. It originates from Christians' tradition of drinking wine in the Eucharist, symbolizing the blood of Christ. In the Champagne region in France, wine started becoming present during baptisms. Thus, it was slowly being used in any religious gatherings. Ancient people would also raise their glass and drink to health and honor. Now, individuals from different parts of the world would make that toast to ring in the new year. Of course, the new year on the Gregorian calendar is not a holy day of any kind. Nothing's sanctioned by God there. But not only that, many just don't drink a simple toast on New Year's Eve. They get plastered. 1 Peter chapter 4. 1 Peter chapter 4, and we'll look at verse 3. That's 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 3. Now, according to Time magazine, New Year's Eve is one of the most dangerous holidays of the year due to drunk driving and alcohol-related injuries and deaths. I know that many of us have participated in many traditions that we shouldn't have in the past, but today, we know better. But again, 1 Peter 4, verse 3. I'll be reading this from the Good News Bible. The King James is a little hard to read here, I think. So, Good News Bible, 1 Peter 4, verse 3. It tells us, you have spent enough time in the past doing what the heathen like to do. Your lives are spent in indecency, lust, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and the disgusting worship of idols. And now the heathen are surprised when you do not join them in the same wild and reckless living, and so they insult you. For they will have to give an account of themselves to God, who's ready to judge the living and the dead. And again, at one time, we may not have known any better. But as disciples of Jesus Christ today, we do. But it seems that most of the traditions of New Year's seem to revolve around gaining favor from the gods. Okay, we're gaining favor from the gods by eating certain foods, making certain promises, kissing the right person. But of course, none of these things involve the true source of our blessings. That, of course, is the one true God. So turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, if you would. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 13. We'll go to verse 11 if I can hold it together here. A little longer, yeah, okay. Many of us did not know why we observed many of the traditions of New Year's Day or New Year's Eve. In the past, we often just followed the crowd, not knowing any better, not knowing what we were doing or why we were doing it, really. But God has called us into His marvelous light and taught us His truth. He's blessed us with understanding. We've learned, and we've grown in Jesus Christ. And hopefully we're all maturing spiritually. Hopefully we don't remain as children who lack maturity in Jesus Christ. Again, 1 Corinthians 13, verse 11. When I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. John, verse 4 next, if you would. That's John chapter 4, verse 23. John chapter 4, verse 23. So as we mature in the faith, we need to give up the childish, the immature, the irresponsible things we once did. So today, do we continue to eat certain foods on New Year's Day to obtain blessings from a foreign god? Do we feel like we need to kiss someone at midnight on New Year's Eve, hopefully the right person, I might add, to determine the course of our next year? Again, John chapter 4, verse 23. But the hour comes, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father seeks such to worship Him. God is a spirit. They that worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth. If we want to please our true God, how do we avoid doing things that might displease Him? Well, obviously, keeping God's commandments is a good idea. But what about a tradition we may not be familiar with? How do we avoid participating in something that might offend our Creator? Maybe we don't know any better. Well, the first thing might be to always understand why we're doing something. If we join the crowd in following a tradition that we don't understand in the first place, why are we doing it anyway? Turns out we're doing something God would approve of, great. But if not, like the worship of false gods and idolatry, we should refrain. And remember that if we sin without knowing it, it's still sin. You might recall there were sacrifices in the Old Testament for unintentional sin. But if we truly love God, we never want to do anything that He would consider an abomination. If we really care, we'll always be careful to ensure that any tradition we practice is not something that God detests. So to conclude today, God's given us a calendar. He's given us His appointed times, His Sabbaths. We use God's calendar to hold our sacred assemblies, to worship Him, and for prophetic meaning. The world has come up with its own calendar, the Gregorian calendar. While this calendar is very accurate, its beginning is certainly arbitrary. We must use a Gregorian calendar to function in today's world. But the first day of the year, like many other holidays, unfortunately brings with it pagan beliefs and practices. We should never do something just because we see someone else do it. Everything we do should be to the glory of God. We should never seek the favor of false gods by observing their traditions. We should not even give the appearance of evil. So we should not be participating in drunken parties tonight on New Year's Eve. We should not kiss someone at midnight in order to secure our luck for the coming year. And we shouldn't deliberately eat certain foods to gain favor with false gods and goddesses. And I promise I won't be jumping off a chair at midnight. There's no way that would end well for me, one way or the other, trust me. Let's go ahead and let's turn to Colossians chapter 2 and verse 8. We'll end with that today. That's Colossians chapter 2. Colossians chapter 2 and verse 8. If we truly love our God, we never want to do anything to disappoint Him. We never want to be associated with false gods or their worship. We never want to try to gain their favor by doing something that is intended to please them. And that's often what we do when we do things like eat certain foods and say it's for good luck. As always, look to God for guidance for our behavior. Look to His holy word. Pray about it. Never allow pride to blind us. Never try to rationalize something we know is wrong. Loving God and respecting Him always should come first. Again, Colossians 2 verse 8 to end today. Here's what it says. Beware, lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ.